They say when you die, you don't feel anything. But I did. I felt everything. I felt the tightness in my chest when I saw them walk in, hand in hand. He wore the same suit I bought him for our 30th anniversary. She wore ivory lace like she was dressing for a wedding, not a funeral. My funeral. And still, they smiled. He whispered something in her ear. She laughed, head tilted back, eyes sparkling like this was a private celebration. People turned to look. Some were confused. Some were embarrassed. No one said a word. But I saw everything. I saw my daughter, Delia, sitting in the second row, stunned. Her eyes didn't leave her father. Her mouth stayed slightly open like she was waiting for him to correct the mistake, to say it was all a misunderstanding. He didn't. I saw Marna, my younger sister, already red-faced with fury. She reached for Delia's hand, but Delia pulled away, hurt and humiliated. Marna shook her head and whispered something I couldn't hear. Delia just kept watching him. My husband who once swore to me on a night we were so young and broke, we could barely afford dinner, that I was the only person who truly knew his soul. Now he stood at my funeral, holding his secretary's hand like it was hers to hold. Like my death had freed him. Like he was finally allowed to love her out loud. But the thing is, I wasn't dead. Not really. Not yet. I had been preparing for this moment long before they had even booked the service. You see, I had felt myself slowly disappearing over the years. Not all at once. No, that would have been too easy. It happened gradually. Like when you step into the ocean and don't realize the tide's pulling you until you can't touch the ground anymore. It started with silence. Then came the condescension. The distant eyes, the gaslighting, the dinner conversations where I'd finish a thought and realize no one had heard me speak, not even him. He'd tell me I was dramatic, that I needed a hobby. He didn't know I had one. Writing. Not the kind of writing you post online for hearts and claps. The kind you write in the margins of old books, on napkins, on the backs of receipts, letters, journals, long, quiet conversations with myself, when no one else would listen. And weeks before the service you're watching now, I'd written the most important letter of my life. Not to my husband, not to my daughter, not even to my sister. It was to the woman I used to be. The woman who let him forget who she was. The woman who kept giving even when her hands were empty. The woman who, despite everything, still believed that love should be kind. That letter now sat folded in my coat pocket. Because this wasn't a funeral, not for me. This was a reckoning. When the service began, the pastor spoke softly, his voice rising and falling with a kind of rhythm that made it feel like a lullaby. I watched him from behind the velvet curtain. He didn't know I was there. No one did, except Marna. She'd helped me pull this off, helped me fake my death, or at least disappear from their lives long enough to make them believe it. It wasn't hard. Victor had been too busy with Brinley to ask many questions. The doctors had been discreet. My lawyer had been precise. And now here we were. The casket was closed. There was no viewing, just a pretty white urn and a photo of me at 40, smiling in our old backyard, before the weight of his indifference had found a home on my shoulders. Victor had chosen the photo. Ironic, considering that was the year he started sleeping in the guest room and blaming stress. Now he was in the front row with Brinley, nodding solemnly, pretending to mourn. But I was done pretending. So when the pastor closed his Bible and gently said, "If anyone has something they'd like to share," I stepped out, and the room froze. Gasps. A chair scraped back. Someone whispered, "Is that?" Victor's head snapped around so fast I thought he might fall off the pew. His mouth opened, then closed. His face drained of color. I walked slowly to the front. I wasn't in black. I wore a soft gray coat and low heels. I didn't need drama. I didn't need fury. I had truth. I turned to face them all, every stunned eye, every slack jaw, and I unfolded my letter. "I'm not here to haunt anyone," I began. but I am here to be heard. And for the first time in over a decade, he listened. Because death, my friends, doesn't always come with silence. Sometimes it walks right into the room, holds up a mirror, and asks, "Now do you see me?" There was a time when Victor looked at me like I was his whole world. We met in the fall of 1980 in a musty old bookstore downtown where I worked part-time after college. He came in looking for a map of Europe and left with a novel, a coffee, and my phone number. I remember how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, like he was always on the edge of a joke meant just for me. He was clever, charming, full of ideas, and he made me feel like I was extraordinary. Not beautiful in the way magazines said I should be, but essential. Like a missing piece he'd finally found. We got married 2 years later, in a small church with chipped pews and flowers from my mother's garden. I wore my sister Marna's veil. Victor cried during his vows. We didn't have much, but we were certain we had enough. Those first years were golden. We shared everything: dreams, cheap wine, laughter in the dark. When Delia was born, he held her like she was made of glass. I remember how he whispered promises into her tiny ear. "You'll never feel unloved. Never." And I believed him. I stayed home with Delia until she was in middle school, then returned to work at the local library. I loved books, order, quiet spaces. I built routines that made our lives easy. Morning tea, clean laundry, home-cooked meals, birthday scrapbooks, handwritten notes tucked into Delia's lunchbox, and little surprises for Victor on Fridays. I wasn't ambitious the way Victor was. I didn't want to climb ladders or make deals. I just wanted to be the steady ground beneath the people I loved. Victor used to call me his calm in the storm. When his real estate business grew, I celebrated every win with him. I didn't mind that he worked late or traveled more. I understood. I trusted him. And for a long time, it felt like he still saw me. Maybe not with the same sparkle as when we were young, but with respect, with comfort, with gratitude. He would kiss me on the forehead and say, "I couldn't do any of this without you." But slowly, so slowly, I didn't even feel it happening. Things began to shift. First, the forehead kisses stopped. Then the conversations shortened. I would ask how his day went and he'd say, "Busy," and walk away. He started bringing home work on weekends, spending more time on his phone during dinner and less time making eye contact. Still, I didn't push. I gave him space. I thought maybe this was just what aging looked like. A quieting down, a settling in. Marna noticed before I did. She'd visit every other Sunday and linger in the kitchen while I cooked. "Easy," she said once, lowering her voice while Victor and Delia sat in the living room. "When's the last time he asked you how you were?" I laughed. "He's busy. Things at the office are a lot right now." She didn't laugh with me. She just stirred her tea and said, "So are you. You just don't have a desk." That stayed with me, but I brushed it off. Marriage changes, I told myself. People go through seasons. He's still here, isn't he? The truth is, I didn't want to believe something was wrong. I wanted to keep that image intact, the one I'd carried for decades. A loving husband, a stable home, a quiet life full of books and tea and letters that meant something. I wanted to believe I was still as calm in the storm. Then came Brinley. At first, she was just a name, a new secretary, young, efficient, eager. Victor spoke of her often, always in a tone that made it clear she was impressing him. "She's sharp," he said, "gets things done before I even ask." I smiled, told him that was great. I made a mental note to bake something for her as a thank you for helping him so much. Back then, I still thought I was part of the we. I didn't know I'd already been quietly excluded. Looking back, that was the last version of our life that felt real to me. The final chapter before the unraveling began. When I think of those days now, they taste like honey and rust, sweet and corroded, familiar and foreign. I miss them, and I don't, because that version of our marriage, the one I protected, fed, nurtured, and clung to, was only half real, the half I carried. He'd already started letting go. I just hadn't noticed yet. The thing about betrayal is it rarely kicks down the door. Most times, it slips in quietly, leaves its shoes by the door, sits at your dinner table and smiles. I remember the exact moment I first felt it, though I didn't call it betrayal back then. I called it a bad feeling, a passing chill. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where the sky glows purple before fading into gray. I had just finished setting the table. Chicken casserole, Victor's favorite, was still warm in the oven. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary. I'd even lit a candle, something I used to do when we were younger when I wanted dinner to feel like an occasion. Victor walked in, phone in hand, suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He didn't kiss my cheek. He didn't ask how my day was. He just kept tapping away at his screen, distracted, grinning at whatever he was reading. "Dinner's ready," I said, trying to keep the warmth in my voice. He nodded, but didn't look up. "Just a sec. Brinley sent something hilarious." I paused, dish towel still in hand. I hadn't heard him laugh like that in weeks. "She's your secretary, right?" I asked, walking back to the kitchen. He murmured, eyes still locked on the phone. "Yeah, she's great. Real sharp. Funny, too." Funny. That word struck me. He hadn't called me funny in years. Victor had always liked women with a quick wit. It was one of the first things he said he loved about me. "You catch jokes before they land," he used to say. Now, apparently, Brinley did too. I walked back into the dining room. He finally sat down and placed his phone screen down on the table. I noticed that. How deliberately he turned it over. He never used to do that. We ate mostly in silence. He chewed quickly, complimented the seasoning, and then leaned back with that same grin on his face. "She told me today that I remind her of Robert Redford," he said suddenly. I blinked. "Brinley did?" "Yeah," he said, laughing. "I told her she needed new glasses." I tried to laugh, but it caught in my throat. He looked flattered, embarrassed even, like a schoolboy who'd just been noticed for the first time. "Sounds like you two talk a lot," I said gently, sipping my water. "She's my assistant," he replied quickly. "It's part of the job." Right. I tried to let it go. After all, what could I accuse him of? Smiling too much? Being flattered? Enjoying someone's company? These weren't crimes. But something in me had shifted. That night, as I folded laundry in the guest room, I replayed the evening in my head. The grin. The phone turned over. The warmth in his voice when he said her name. It wasn't the words, it was the lightness. That ease. The kind of ease people have when they feel newly seen. And I hadn't made him feel that way in a long time. Maybe that was my fault. Maybe I'd gotten boring, predictable. Maybe the quiet routines I took pride in, the folded towels, the early dinners, the handwritten grocery lists, had made me fade into the wallpaper of his life. Still, I remember watching him that night, asleep in bed, the lines on his face soft in the glow of the bedside lamp. He looked peaceful, innocent even. I wanted so badly to believe that I was overthinking, that I was just feeling insecure, that menopause was making me emotional, that the problem was in my head, not in our marriage. So I buried it, smoothed it over like a wrinkle in fresh sheets. But after that night, the small things started to matter more. How often he mentioned her name, how quickly he responded to her texts, how he stopped sharing little stories with me at the end of the day. Then came the laughter, loud and unguarded, while he was on the phone in his office, door half closed. One afternoon, as I was dusting the hallway, I heard her voice through the speakerphone. She said, "Victor, you're so bad," followed by a giggle. He chuckled. "Don't tell my wife." I froze, not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it. Playful, familiar, like it was an inside joke. He didn't know I was there. I backed away from the door. My hands were shaking. I didn't confront him. I didn't storm in and demand answers. That wasn't how I was raised. You didn't accuse people of things unless you had proof. And besides, he hadn't technically done anything wrong. At least that's what I told myself. But that night, I didn't sleep. That was the first night I started writing again. I pulled out an old journal from the back of my closet and opened to a fresh page. I wrote one line: "When love starts hiding, it doesn't need to scream." And I knew, deep down, I had just seen the first crack in the life I'd spent 40 years building. A crack shaped like a smile I wasn't meant to see. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't one big argument or an affair caught red-handed. That would have been easier in a way. Loud things get dealt with. This was quiet, like fog creeping under a door, soft, slow, and almost gentle, until I couldn't see myself anymore. Victor had always been a man of motion, always on the phone, running to meetings, traveling to property viewings. I used to admire that, his drive, his energy. I'd tell people, my husband never sits still, like it was a good thing, like I was proud to be his stillness. But after Brinley came into the picture, it wasn't just his schedule that became full. His absence was different now. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and it had weight. Conversations became transactions. "How was your day?" I'd ask. "Busy," he'd say, eyes still on his laptop. "Brinley booked 3 back-to-back closings. She's really on top of things." I'd nod, try not to let it sting. I'd place a cup of tea beside him. He wouldn't notice. When I told him Delia had called, he'd ask, "Did she need something?" When I reminded him about our anniversary coming up, he said, "Let's just keep it low-key this year." Low-key meant forgotten. He didn't even say goodnight some evenings. He'd just go to bed after brushing his teeth and leave the light off for me to find my way in alone. I started talking less, not out of spite, out of exhaustion. It takes energy to keep making space in a conversation that has no room for you. I remember once, in the middle of a Saturday lunch, I said, "Do you ever feel like we're roommates?" Victor didn't even look up. He just said, "Don't start." That was it. Not "Why do you feel that way?" Not "What's going on?" Just "Don't start." That was the rule, unspoken but always enforced. Don't make it uncomfortable. Don't disrupt the surface. Don't be a problem. So, I didn't. I stopped telling him when I had trouble sleeping. I stopped asking if we could go for walks. I stopped reminding him of the small things that used to connect us. Cherry pie from Rose's Cafe, movies on Friday nights, crossword puzzles on Sunday morning. I shrank to make space for his life. And he never noticed the shrinking. Some days I wondered if I disappeared altogether. Would he even mention it? I watched him bloom in her attention. Laughing more, dressing sharper, wearing cologne again, I recognized the version of him he showed her. That used to be mine. Brinley's name was on everything now. Her suggestions, her taste, her presence lingered in our house in small, invisible ways. I found a coffee receipt in his jacket pocket. 2 oat milk lattes, extra cinnamon. I don't drink oat milk. She did. I knew because I'd seen her order one the day she dropped by the house to drop off paperwork. She was overly sweet. That sugary, breathy tone some young women use when they're trying to seem harmless. I offered her tea. She declined. I offered her a seat. She didn't take it, but she looked around my home like she already knew where things were. Later that evening, I asked Victor, "Why didn't you tell me she was stopping by?" He shrugged. "Didn't think it mattered." That sentence stayed with me. Didn't think it mattered. I went upstairs that night and opened my journal again. Wrote, "What a strange thing to live in a house you built and feel like a guest." Even Marna noticed. She came by one afternoon, found me rearranging photo frames in the hallway, trying to find something to control. She tilted her head and said, "Izzy, when's the last time he said your name?" I paused. I couldn't remember, not in affection, not even in passing. He called me hey or babe or nothing at all. Sometimes silence is louder than cruelty. You expect pain from betrayal. But neglect? Neglect makes you question if you ever mattered at all. I wasn't being yelled at. I wasn't being cheated on, at least not in the way you can prove. I was being erased, gently, daily, systematically. And somehow, the world kept turning. People saw us together at fundraisers and dinner parties and thought we were a solid couple. They saw him open doors and pose for pictures. They saw my smile, my pearls, my steady presence. No one saw the hollow behind my eyes, because you can't photograph absence. Victor still slept in our bed. He still signed cards with Love V. He still introduced me as his wife. But it was all presentation. The connection, the affection, the small everyday threads that tie two people together, gone. And I was too ashamed to say it out loud. Because what do you even call that? How do you explain being starved in a full house? It was a Friday evening. Victor had invited a few colleagues over for drinks and light dinner. Nothing fancy, just some real estate partners, their wives, and of course, Brinley. I hadn't seen her since the coffee receipt, and now here she was standing in my home like it belonged more to her than to me. She wore a fitted blazer, too tight for a professional setting, and heels that clicked across my hardwood floor like punctuation. She carried a bottle of wine she didn't offer to me, only to Victor. He grinned when he saw her. "You didn't have to," he said, accepting the wine with both hands. "I wanted to," she replied, brushing her fingers against his for a second too long. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they did, and chose not to. The other wives made polite small talk. I was cordial, of course. I knew how to host. I'd spent most of my life mastering the art of graceful invisibility. I arranged the hors d'oeuvres. I kept the wine glasses full. I laughed when everyone else did, even when I didn't hear the joke. Around 9 p.m., I brought out dessert. My homemade lemon bars, dusted with powdered sugar, chilled just right. They were Victor's favorite, had been for years. "Who made these?" one of the wives asked. "I did," I said, smiling as I placed the plate on the coffee table. Brinley picked one up delicately, then turned to Victor and said with a playful smirk, "Looks like your wife really is the domestic type." There was something in her tone, not admiration, mockery, a condescension hidden under honey. Victor chuckled. Actually, chuckled. "Yeah," he said, not looking at me. "She's always been more comfortable in the kitchen than the office." The room went quiet for a beat. The kind of pause where people wonder if they just witnessed something inappropriate and then choose to move on anyway. I stood there, still holding the plate. Something cracked. Not loudly, but cleanly, like glass snapping beneath a slippered foot. I walked back to the kitchen without a word. I didn't cry. I didn't drop the plate or storm off. I just stood at the sink, staring out the window at the darkness, trying to remember the last time he had complimented something I made without someone else present. It wasn't the words themselves that hurt. It was the way they were said, like I was some outdated piece of furniture he kept around for tradition, a relic of a previous version of his life. He didn't mean for it to be cruel. That's what made it worse. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He just didn't care if he did. 10 minutes later, he came into the kitchen, glass of wine in hand. "Why are you sulking?" he asked. "I'm not sulking," I replied softly. "I just needed a minute." "You're always so sensitive lately," he said, sipping his wine. "You should learn to take a joke." I didn't answer, because I realized something in that moment. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a rough patch. This wasn't something we were going to fix with a weekend away or a long talk. This was who he was now, and worse, this was how he saw me. Not as a partner, not as a woman, not even as someone who deserved dignity. Just a caretaker with a pie crust and a quiet mouth. I finished the dishes. I went upstairs. I wrote another line in my journal. Humiliation wears a quiet face. It walks beside you as if it belongs. I reread it twice. That night, I lay in bed while Victor stayed downstairs laughing too loudly at something Brinley said. The walls of my home felt thinner than ever. I was supposed to be asleep, but I wasn't. I was wide awake, finally hearing the silence for what it was, a warning, and I knew there wouldn't be another dinner like that, not for me. After that night, the lemon bars, the laughter, the sharp edge behind Brinley's smile, I stopped trying, not in a dramatic way. There was no screaming, no ultimatums, no scenes that would have made a good story for Victor to tell later. I simply released the rope. I stopped making his tea in the mornings. He never asked why. I stopped waiting up for him. Some nights, I didn't even hear the door. I stopped reminding him about anniversaries, birthdays, or family dinners. And he didn't notice their absence. I was still living in the same house, still sleeping in the same bed. But emotionally, I had stepped outside long ago. What kept me from physically leaving in those first few weeks was habit, mostly, and shame. Shame that I had stayed too long, that I had become one of those women I used to pity. Women who allowed themselves to be slowly erased by a man who no longer loved them just because the alternative was terrifying. It wasn't until Marna came over one afternoon and found me folding laundry in the guest room that I finally said it out loud. "I think I'm done," I said, holding a pillowcase against my chest like a shield. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. She just nodded and said, "Took you long enough." Then she helped me fold the rest of the linens. Delia called that night. We spoke for 20 minutes. I didn't mention Victor. She didn't ask. I think she knew something was off, but she also knew me. How private I was. How carefully I chose when and how to say certain things. We were never a mother-daughter pair that bled emotion all over each other. We were closer in silence, in thoughtful gestures. But even she was beginning to notice the gaps. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. I didn't take much. Just a few clothes, my journals, and the book Victor had given me the first Christmas we spent together, Wuthering Heights, with an inscription that read, "For the storm in you that matches the storm in me." I held the book for a long time. Then I put it back on the shelf. Whatever storm he once saw in me had passed years ago. I wrote him a note, not a dramatic letter, just a single page left on the kitchen counter. "Victor, I'll be staying with Marna for a while. The house is clean. There's food in the fridge. You won't notice I'm gone, but I needed to say it anyway. Isolde." I waited until I heard his car back out of the driveway for a late meeting, probably with her. Then I wheeled my suitcase to the front porch. Marna was already waiting in her car. She didn't say anything. She just opened the trunk. We didn't speak much on the drive. I stared out the window, watching the trees pass by like soft brushstrokes. I kept thinking, this is what it feels like to leave something you loved without bitterness. It's not rage. It's not revenge. It's grief. But clean. Like stepping out of a burning house you didn't realize was on fire until you smelled the smoke on your clothes. When we got to Marna's, she helped me set up in her guest room. Fresh linens, a vase of lilacs on the windowsill, my favorite tea already stocked in her pantry. She didn't ask me to explain myself. She just gave me a space to breathe. That first night, I didn't cry. I expected to. But all I felt was stillness. Not relief, not peace. Just the unfamiliar silence of no longer performing, no longer pretending to be okay in a house where I had become invisible. Victor didn't call. Not that day, not the next, not even after the week passed. It was as if I had never lived there at all. I kept thinking about that, how easy it was for him to let go of me, while I had spent months aching over how to let go of him. And still, a part of me hoped, not for reconciliation, but for acknowledgement, a call, a message, a question, anything that said, "I noticed," but nothing came. And that, more than anything, confirmed I had done the right thing. Leaving wasn't about getting him back, it was about getting me back. I began walking in the mornings. Just around Marna's quiet neighborhood, past rows of sleepy houses and front lawns dotted with bird feeders. I listened to the sound of my own footsteps and thought, this is mine. This time, this space, this solitude. Mine. I began journaling again, not just about pain, but about memories. Small moments I'd buried. The first time Delia called me Mama, the way Victor used to squeeze my knee under the dinner table when no one was looking, my father's hands when he gardened. Not everything was broken. Not everything had to be. But this chapter? It was closed. Quietly. Without fireworks. Just a woman with a suitcase and a heart that had finally stopped waiting to be seen. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't heal you. It just makes your emptiness louder. At first, staying at Marna's felt like a break, like a deep breath after holding one for too long. But after a few days, the silence stopped being gentle. It started to echo. She was always kind, never pushy. She gave me space to think, write, rest. But the stillness settled around me like dust, covering every thought I tried to escape. The mornings were the hardest. I'd wake early, long before Marna did, and sit by the window in the guest room. The sun would filter through the lace curtains, casting soft, dappled shadows on the hardwood floor. I'd hold a mug of tea and stare at nothing. No texts, no calls, no noise, just me and the absence. Victor didn't reach out, not even once. I kept my phone charged just in case. I told myself I wasn't waiting, but I was. I would watch the screen when it lit up, hoping for his name. But it was always a spam alert or an old friend asking politely how I was. I'd answer with, fine, even when I felt like I was dissolving. One morning, a full week after I'd left, I went to the bathroom and saw something that made me freeze. A clump of hair on the sink, not a few strands, a clump, thick, coiled, lifeless. I ran my hands through my scalp and pulled back more. My heart started pounding. At first I thought it was stress, the trauma, the emotional spiral I'd been tumbling down. But my body was trying to tell me something, and I'd ignored it too long. That same afternoon, Marna insisted we see a doctor. I resisted. She didn't push. She simply drove me there. Blood tests, scans, quiet murmurs behind closed doors. A week later, the results came in. Ovarian cancer, stage 3, aggressive. The word aggressive clung to the edge of the room like smoke. I stared at the doctor's lips as he spoke, but I don't think I heard half of it. He said things like treatment options, chemotherapy, time frames, but all I could think was, how could my body betray me when I just walked away from everything else? Marna reached for my hand. I didn't squeeze back. I wasn't angry, I was just empty. I had left a marriage of 35 years, lost the man I once thought would hold my hand through everything, and now my body, this body I had used to nurture, to cook, to care, to stay, was now fighting me too. That night, I sat in the bathtub for over an hour. The water went cold. I didn't move. I looked at my arms. They still looked the same. But I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I thought about Victor, not to blame him. I didn't have the energy for anger. I just wondered if he'd even care. If he knew. If he'd stop laughing long enough to feel something. If he'd tell Brinley. Would they pause for a moment? Or just raise their glasses and toast to fate? I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. Tears are for people who still feel hope. I didn't. Not that night. That night, I wrote no journal entry, no poem, no letter, just silence. The next morning, Marna found me sitting outside, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the fence. "You didn't sleep," she said. I shook my head. She sat down beside me and placed a thermos of tea in my lap. After a while, she said, "You're allowed to fall apart." I didn't answer, because I wasn't falling apart. I was disappearing, piece by piece, day by day, first as a wife, then as a woman, now as a body. It felt like the world was folding in on me, not violently, just gently, like a closing book. And I thought, maybe this is what it means to die slowly, not with a bang, but with a fading heartbeat no one notices. That was my rock bottom, not a dramatic collapse, not screaming in the rain, just sitting in a chair on a porch, tea gone cold in my hands, with nothing inside me but silence. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid that I could vanish entirely, and no one would remember the sound of my voice. After the diagnosis, time bent. The days melted together into a haze of appointments, blood work, soft voices, and the sterile hum of hospital lights. I wore the same 2 sweaters in rotation and stopped brushing my hair when it started falling in clumps. Every hour felt heavy. The future felt far away. I didn't tell Victor. Not because I wanted to punish him, because I couldn't picture his voice saying anything that would make it better. I couldn't stand the thought of being pitied by a man who had once stopped seeing me long before my body did. So I told Delia instead. Her voice cracked over the phone, but she didn't cry. Not right away. She asked for details. She asked if I wanted her to come home. I told her no, not yet. I needed time to understand it myself before I carried anyone else through it. A few days later, I found myself going through an old cedar chest in Marna's attic. I don't even know what I was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe some proof that I had once lived with joy, that I had laughed, been young, been seen. The chest smelled like time, dry paper and lavender and something faintly metallic. I pulled out photo albums, old letters, a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with a ribbon. At the bottom, beneath a pressed blue scarf I hadn't seen in 20 years, I found a small box. It was wooden, worn at the edges, and had a tiny brass latch. I didn't remember it until I opened it. Inside were letters, all addressed to me, but not from anyone else. They were all in my handwriting, journals I had kept during my 20s and 30s, notes I had written to myself, letters I had meant to reread one day, and I never did, until now. The first one was dated June 18th, 1994. I unfolded the paper carefully as if it might break in my hands. Dear Essie, I know you feel tired, but I see you. I see how you hold everything together when no one is looking. I see how you smile even when you're not okay. You are not invisible. You are the reason the house breathes. You matter. My breath caught in my throat. The words were mine, but they didn't sound like the woman I had become. They sounded like the woman I used to be, the one who believed in herself, the one who could carry pain without letting it define her, the one who still had faith in her voice. I read another, then another. They weren't long, just little time capsules, notes I had written on bad days in quiet corners, trying to remind myself that I was whole. I held the box in my lap and cried for the first time in weeks, not because I was sad, because I had forgotten I was ever strong. I sat there in the attic for over an hour, surrounded by dust and memories, holding the written proof that I had once loved myself enough to leave breadcrumbs. And now I had found them. I didn't feel cured. I didn't feel better. But I felt awake. It was like someone had lit a single candle in a dark room. The room was still there. The shadows were still around me. But for the first time, I could see a little further than my grief. I wasn't nothing. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't some broken version of who I used to be. I was still me, even if the mirror didn't always show it. I placed the letters back in the box, careful to retie the ribbon just as I'd found it. When I came back down, Marna was in the kitchen. She didn't ask why my eyes were red. She just slid a bowl of soup across the table and said, "I added extra time. You always like that." I took the spoon and smiled. I did. That night, I opened my journal and wrote a full page. First time in weeks. I wrote about the attic, about the letters, about the quiet woman I used to be who had tried so hard to leave me a map home. And then I ended the entry with something simple. There is still something left in me, and I intend to find it. It wasn't a promise. It was a beginning. Waking up the next morning felt different. The weight was still there. Cancer, loss, the pieces of a broken marriage. But something had shifted. Slightly. Like a door in my chest had been cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of air. It wasn't joy. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something quieter. Something steadier. It was resolve. That day I dressed differently. Not for anyone else. For me. I pulled out a navy blue sweater I hadn't worn in months. I brushed my hair and dabbed on a little rose balm, not to look good, to feel present. When Marna walked into the kitchen, she paused mid-step. "You're glowing," she said with a crooked smile. "I found myself in the attic," I said, smiling back. She didn't ask for details. That's the thing about sisters. They don't need the whole story to feel the ending. I spent the afternoon organizing my letters, the ones I'd found and the new ones I'd begun writing. There was one addressed to Delia, one to myself, one, strangely, to the version of me that had stayed in the marriage for far too long. I told her I forgave her, but the one that mattered most was the letter I began writing to be read after I was gone. A truth letter. Not revenge, not anger, just everything I had never been allowed to say out loud. Every sentence I had swallowed for the sake of peace. Every betrayal I had buried beneath "it's fine." Every moment I had diminished myself so he could shine a little brighter. I wrote it with my whole heart, not as a victim, but as a witness. The kind of letter a woman writes when she has nothing left to lose and everything left to say. I didn't cry while writing it. It felt clean, like clearing out a room that had been locked for years. The dust rising, the sunlight pouring in, the silence finally making space for something honest. That night, I placed the letter in a cream-colored envelope and sealed it with wax. Then I set it in my nightstand drawer. I didn't know when I'd use it or if, but I knew I needed it to exist, because sometimes power isn't in confrontation. Sometimes it's in preparation. A few days later, I went with Marna to a local art exhibit. She'd been asking me for weeks, and I kept putting it off. But something told me to say yes this time. We walked through rooms filled with color, canvases bursting with movement, life, mess. I stood in front of one abstract painting for nearly 20 minutes. It looked like chaos at first, but the longer I stared, the more I saw. Shapes, flow, purpose inside the noise. It reminded me of my life. Marna tapped my arm and pointed out an artist's quote printed on the wall. "Some things must shatter before the light gets in." I took a picture of it with my phone. That quote stayed with me for weeks. When we got home, I looked in the mirror, not to see what was wrong, but to acknowledge what had survived. The hair was thinning. My skin looked pale. My body was slower, tired, but my eyes were different. They were awake. That night, I pulled out my laptop for the first time in months, not to check email, to start writing again, a story about a woman who disappeared inside her marriage and found herself again in the quiet. A woman who realized her worth didn't depend on being seen, but on seeing herself clearly. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was mine. And with each sentence, I felt more whole, more grounded, more real. That week, I also called Delia again, not to tell her anything new, just to talk, to really talk. We laughed about a memory from her childhood, how she used to dress up in my scarves and perform songs in the living room. "I thought you didn't remember those things," I said. She laughed. "I remember everything, Mom. I just didn't always know how to say it." There was a pause, a soft one. "I miss you," she whispered. "I'm still here," I said. And for the first time, I meant it. Not just physically, but here, in the fullest sense. Present, listening, awake. It didn't happen all at once, but every day I took one small step. Some days it was writing. Some days it was just sitting in silence without collapsing into it. Some days it was letting Marna hold my hand without feeling ashamed. And slowly the numbness began to lift. Not because life got easier, but because I stopped pretending I was powerless in it. I was still sick, still bruised by grief, still heart-wounded. But I was not gone, and I refused to let anyone, least of all him, be the final narrator of my story. By the time October rolled around, I had made peace with the cancer. Not because I'd accepted it fully, but because it no longer terrified me into silence. What terrified me now was the thought of leaving the world without telling my story, on my terms, without setting the record straight, not out of vengeance, out of necessity. Because women like me, we get rewritten all the time, turned into background characters, reduced to bitter ex-wives, or forgotten names in dusty family photo albums. I wasn't going to let that happen. So, While Victor toasted wine glasses with Brinley and played the grieving husband in public, I began preparing, quietly, without announcement, without drama. I hired a lawyer, Ms. Carla Juneau, mid-40s, tough, blunt, the kind of woman who didn't waste time with pleasantries. I explained everything: the neglect, the absence, the way I had left without resistance, the diagnosis. She listened carefully, nodding only when it mattered. "You want to make a will?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, and a letter." She raised an eyebrow. "A legal letter? Number A personal one? I want it read at my funeral, in my voice." She didn't blink. Done. We discussed the logistics, the inheritance, the property, the savings Victor thought were his to spend. I made clear, in exact language, that everything, my half, would go to Delia and Marna. He would get nothing. No house, no investments, not even the letters I had kept in that old wooden box. "They don't need to know until after," I said. "I want him to be comfortable." Her mouth twitched. "You sure you're not angry?" "I'm sure," I replied. "I'm not planning revenge. I'm just documenting truth." She looked at me for a long time. "You're dangerous in the best way," she said finally. I smiled. Over the next few weeks, I did more than paperwork. I began sorting through my life. Old journals, photos, recipes, cards from Delia's school years. I compiled them into a small box labeled "What Mattered." Not for anyone else. For me. So I could look at that box on hard days and remind myself that I had lived, loved, created things that had weight, that my life wasn't defined by the way it ended, but by how deeply I had rooted myself in it, even when no one was watching. One afternoon, Marna came into the room and saw me printing something. "What's that?" she asked. "Something for later," I said, slipping the paper into a new envelope. She sat on the edge of the bed. "You're planning something." I looked up. "I'm preparing something." "There's a difference." She reached for my hand. "Whatever it is." "I hope I get to see it." "You will," I said. "You'll be the one to bring it to life." A few days later, I made one more phone call, to Delia. We spoke for nearly an hour. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I told her how proud I was of her, how much I admired her strength, how sorry I was for all the years I stayed quiet when I should have demanded more. She cried then, not because she was sad, because she understood. "Mom," she said, "I want to come visit." "Soon," I promised. "I want you to remember me standing tall, not hooked to machines." She sniffled. "I'll bring your favorite candle." "Lavender?" I asked, smiling. "No," she replied. "The gardenia one you pretend you don't love." We both laughed. That night, I pulled out the cream-colored envelope again. I reread the letter inside. It was calm, measured, not emotional, not chaotic, just truth. It told the story of a woman who gave everything she had, love, labor, time, tenderness, and was slowly erased for it. It named no villains. It just refused to protect the silence anymore. I placed it beside my will in a fireproof folder and locked it in the drawer Marna kept in her home office. Then I gave her a key. "When the time comes," I said, "you'll know what to do." She didn't ask questions. She just pressed the key into her palm and nodded. The final step in my setup was something small, but sacred. I bought myself a new coat. Not expensive, just soft, lined with a pale gray satin. It reminded me of the one I wore on my honeymoon in the French countryside, the trip Victor once described as cute but slow. I chose that coat for a reason, because if there was going to be a moment, if there was going to be a time when I showed up again, even briefly, it wouldn't be in black. It would be in dignity, in softness, in the exact version of myself I wanted to be remembered as. I didn't rush anything. I didn't announce anything. I let him believe the version of the story that made him most comfortable. The story where I had faded away quietly, where the chapter had closed with no ripple. But chapters don't close themselves, and I was writing the final one myself. Pen in hand, voice ready, silence prepared. By early November, Victor had settled into the role of the grieving husband, at least on the surface. He told his colleagues I was very ill, that I'd gone to a private facility, that I wasn't taking visitors, that he was respecting my peace. Respecting. That word nearly made me laugh. He said it with a somber voice, even practiced the look, the tilt of the head, the slight pause before speaking. He had perfected the kind of grief that plays well in country clubs and charity galas. Brinley, of course, was never far behind. People whispered, but no one said it outright. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they just didn't care. But it didn't matter, because while they played dress-up with my disappearance, I was preparing the curtain call, and something strange began to happen. Victor started to unravel, not all at once, just little things. He missed deadlines, forgot property signings, misplaced key documents. One of his partners, an older gentleman named Harris, whom I'd known for years, called Marna's landline looking for me. Not Victor. Me. "Isolde?" he asked when I answered. I know this might sound strange, but I was hoping to confirm something. I said nothing. He continued. "Victor's been off lately. In meetings, out of them, things feel different. And I just remembered, he always had it together when you were around. Everything went smoother. There it was, that subtle acknowledgement. Even in my absence, I was being felt, not as a ghost, but as the backbone they never credited. I never meant to destroy Victor's world. I only meant to remove myself from it. But the thing about support is, when it leaves, everything that leaned on it begins to sway. Brinley tried to step into my place, of course, tried to manage his calendar, his moods, his messes. But she didn't understand how to keep his world balanced. She hadn't spent 35 years learning his silences, predicting his reactions, absorbing his selfishness like a sponge. She wasn't built for endurance. She was built for attention. And now that she had all of it, without the contrast of my invisibility to highlight her sparkle, she started to wilt. Marna told me she heard from someone at the brokerage firm that Brinley had been reprimanded for gossiping about the wife's condition. Apparently, she referred to me as basically out of the picture. Victor didn't correct her, but others noticed. And slowly, the support began to fall away. Not in protests, not in confrontation, in quiet withdrawals, lunches canceled, invites missed, emails ignored. Because even the most socially graceful people know there's something unsettling about celebrating with a man whose wife hasn't officially died, but is already being replaced. It made them uncomfortable. Not because they liked me, because they understood they could be me. Meanwhile, Delia began asking more questions. She texted Victor, asking for updates. He deflected. She asked if he had plans to visit me. He said he was giving space. One afternoon, she called Marna directly. "He hasn't even sent flowers," Delia said, her voice tight with restrained fury. "He hasn't asked about her chemo. He barely responds to my messages." Marna didn't say much, just enough. "Delia, some silences speak louder than lies." There was a pause. Then Delia said softly, "Something doesn't feel right." That's when she booked her flight. I didn't know she was coming until Marna opened my door and whispered, "Your daughter's coming home." My heart stuttered. I wasn't ready. Not for pity, not for tears, not for the disappointment in her eyes. But then I realized I wasn't the one who should feel ashamed. The night before Delia arrived, I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat with Marna over tea. "He's starting to fall apart," Marna said, "and you didn't have to lift a finger." "I didn't want destruction," I said quietly. "Just truth. You gave it to him, even if he doesn't know it yet." We sat in silence for a while. Then I whispered something I hadn't said out loud yet. "I'm not afraid of him forgetting me. I'm afraid I ever allowed him to forget me while I was still standing in the same room." Marna reached for my hand. "You're not invisible anymore, Isi. And soon, neither is what he did." I could feel the shift now, Not just around Victor, but inside myself. The woman who once tiptoed through her own house, trying not to disturb the man who didn't see her, she was gone, replaced by someone sharper, calmer, not bitter, but resolved. I was no longer hoping for him to notice. I was building something stronger than recognition. I was building memory, memory that would outlive his version of the story. Because that's what power is when it's quiet. It's not volume, it's certainty. And mine had returned. The chapel smelled like lilies and old wood. Rows of people filled the pews, most dressed in black, some in confusion. No music played, just that soft, respectful murmur people use at funerals when they don't really know what to say. It was a bright winter morning. The sky outside was clear. Inside, the air felt wrong, too cold, too rehearsed, too hollow. Victor stood at the front, dressed in his best suit, the navy one I had pressed for him last Christmas. His hair was neatly combed, his tie crisp. Brinley stood beside him in a fitted ivory dress. Not black, ivory. She dabbed fake tears with a monogrammed handkerchief she likely borrowed just for the performance. Victor nodded solemnly to guests as they arrived. He greeted them like a man managing his grief with grace. A few even patted his back, told him how brave he was, how sorry they were for his loss. What loss? He had lost nothing. He had discarded something and now expected applause for pretending it hurt. In the front row sat Delia, stone-faced. Her eyes were locked on her father with a confusion that was slowly turning to quiet rage. She didn't look sad. She looked betrayed. Marna sat beside her, hands clasped, holding the weight of the secret we'd planned for weeks. And then, the pastor cleared his throat. He stepped up to the podium and began speaking gently about love, loss, and letting go. He quoted scripture. He told a short story about me that Victor had submitted, something shallow and generic about how I loved books and quiet places. I nearly laughed from behind the velvet curtain. Quiet places. That was how he defined my entire existence. When the pastor closed the Bible and invited anyone forward to speak, the room hushed. Brinley clutched Victor's hand. No one moved. Then Marna rose. She didn't speak, just walked calmly toward the altar, a cream-colored envelope in her hand. Delia turned her head sharply. Victor blinked. And then I stepped out. From the back of the chapel, one foot in front of the other, coat buttoned, hair wrapped in a silk scarf, eyes steady. The sound of my shoes echoed down the aisle. People gasped. Someone in the third row said, "Isn't that?" Victor's head turned, and his face lost every ounce of color. He took a step back as if he'd seen a ghost. Brinley's mouth fell open. Delia stood. "Mom?" I nodded softly. "I'm here." The room fell into stunned silence. I reached the front, turned to face them, and took the envelope from Marna. I looked at Victor, really looked at him, and then at everyone else. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I just began reading. My name is Isolde Ray, and despite what this ceremony suggests, I am not gone. I've simply been erased, not by death, but by years of being unseen. I paused, letting the words sink in. I spent 35 years married to the man standing before you. I raised our daughter, managed our home, stood by his side while he built his empire. And slowly, brick by brick, he built a world without me in it. Victor's jaw clenched. He tried to step forward. Delia held out her hand without turning her head. "No," she said firmly. "You'll sit." He sat. Brinley looked like she wanted to vanish. I continued. "This letter is not about blame. It's about truth. It's about the thousands of silent sacrifices made by women like me, who disappear behind men who smile in public and forget in private. I did not die. I left. I left the silence. I left the absence. And I left a story behind that would no longer protect anyone's comfort." I turned to face him directly. "Victor, I loved you when no one was watching, and you stopped loving me when everyone was. You replaced partnership with pity and tenderness with tolerance. You thought my quiet was weakness. It wasn't. It was restraint. The room was breathless. No one moved. I am not here to shame you. I am here to unhide myself, to make sure that the story told after I'm gone will be mine, not yours, not hers, mine. Then I folded the letter, and I said, "Now you may bury the version of me that made you comfortable, but the rest of me still lives." Then I walked out, just like I walked out of our marriage, not in anger, but in clarity. And that, more than anything I ever screamed or sobbed, was what left the room shaken, not my presence, but the power of finally being seen. After I walked out of the chapel, I didn't look back. Not once. The sun was shining. A breeze moved gently through the bare trees. My hands were steady, even though my body was tired. Marna met me by the car. She opened the door without a word, her eyes wet. Inside, Delia sat silently. We didn't speak as we drove away. There was nothing more to say, because it had all been said. Everything I had buried under years of silence, of quiet tolerance, of shrinking myself just to keep peace, that was over. I had handed them the truth in my own voice, and now the aftermath would write itself. Later that evening, as we sat around Marna's fireplace, Delia broke the quiet. "Mom," she said, barely above a whisper, "did you mean it? That you're really leaving everything to us?" I nodded. "Every cent, every account, every key." She looked down at her hands. "He's going to be furious." "I know." Delia looked up, her eyes shining, but strong. "Good." We both laughed. The next morning, my lawyer Carla delivered the formal will and asset documents to Victor via messenger. The envelope was sealed, neat, professional. Inside, it laid out the following: the house, left to Delia; the investment accounts, split between Delia and a women's education trust I had quietly started; the business shares, already withdrawn and sold, converted to a private donation; the pension account, liquidated into a terminal illness fund I'd created in my name; the remaining bank balance, transferred to Marna and Delia jointly. Victor's name appeared nowhere. Not once. Not even in the memorandum of personal effects. Because there was nothing personal left to give him. He'd already discarded it years ago. According to Carla, he didn't take it well. The messenger said he turned red, then white, then asked if it was a mistake. "It's not," she replied. Brinley, apparently, stood behind him, reading over his shoulder, speechless. She wouldn't stay long after that, not because of the will, but because men like Victor are only charming when they're winning, when the room still believes in their image. And now the room had changed. People started to talk. Whispers grew louder. Not gossip, truth. One by one, former colleagues stopped returning his calls. His name was quietly removed from 2 speaking events. A foundation Delia was involved with revoked his honorary board status. No press releases, no scandal, just withdrawal. Because sometimes the most devastating punishment isn't public humiliation. It's the slow, permanent erosion of access. Victor tried to call me 3 times. He left voicemails that sounded rehearsed, measured, manipulated. "Isolde, I think we need to talk. I didn't realize how much this was hurting you." I was just confused. I deleted all 3 without listening to the end. The 4th time, I answered, but I didn't speak. I let him talk, and talk, and talk. Excuses, backpedals, rewrites. "I never stopped caring about you," he said at one point. That was when I quietly hung up and blocked the number. A week later, I mailed him one last envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature. It read, "You once told me I was your calm in the storm. And I believed you, but the truth is, I was the ground beneath your feet. You never noticed until you fell." I didn't hear from him again after that, but I heard about him. Brinley left his firm within a month, moved back to Portland, married someone else within the year. Victor sold the house, started downsizing. Delia told me he tried to invite her to lunch one day. She declined. He looked smaller, she said. Not sad, just like he didn't know where he fit anymore. I said nothing, because I understood. He didn't know where he fit anymore because the story had moved on, and he wasn't the hero. He wasn't even the villain. He was just irrelevant. For me, justice didn't come with applause. It came with stillness, peace. A final chapter I had written with my own pen, on my own terms. The kind of justice that doesn't scream but sits in the corner of a room and changes how people remember the past. The kind that cannot be undone. It was quiet again. The will had been delivered. The voicemails had stopped. Victor had gone silent, retreating back into whatever shadows he now occupied. And in that stillness, for the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by the absence of a man. I felt surrounded by presence. Mine. The days were slow, but clean. I wrote more. Slept more. Ate in silence without shrinking into it. Marna and I planted tulip bulbs in her garden and marked the dirt with little wooden stakes. It felt symbolic. Planting something I might not live to see bloom, but doing it anyway. Then, one gray afternoon, the doorbell rang. Marna opened it and I heard a familiar voice. Hi. I was hoping to surprise her, if that's okay. Delia. I walked to the hallway and paused. For a second, my breath caught. Not because I hadn't seen her recently. We'd spoken, she'd visited, we'd cried. But this was different. She looked like she had something to say. She was holding a small book, wrapped in soft green cloth. Come in, I said. She followed me into the kitchen where the smell of tea and lavender soap lingered. She set the book on the table, then sat down across from me. I've been reading through your letters, she said softly. The ones you left for me and the ones Marna saved. I nodded, waiting. There's a lot I didn't understand before, she said. When I was younger, I thought you were just quiet, predictable. I didn't realize you were surviving in silence. Her voice broke slightly. I should have seen it. I reached across the table and took her hand. No, baby, you were never supposed to carry what I didn't know how to share. She held my hand tightly, her eyes wet. But I want to now, she said. I want to know everything about you, about what you gave, about what I missed. I smiled. Then sit, I'll make tea. As I moved around the kitchen, something shifted inside me. I wasn't trying to win her back. I wasn't afraid she'd leave again. I was steady, because I had nothing to prove anymore. And that, I realized, was what love looked like when you didn't need it to fill a hole. It was just light on top of already steady ground. We drank tea as the rain started tapping the windows. She asked questions, real ones. Did you ever want to leave earlier? Did you ever think Dad loved you, really? Did you miss being seen? I answered them all. Not like a mother giving a lesson, but like a woman sharing her story. And in the end, she said something I never expected. You were stronger than I gave you credit for. I laughed softly. That makes two of us. Before she left that evening, she handed me the book. I unwrapped it slowly. It was an old family photo album, filled with pictures I hadn't seen in decades. Me holding her as a baby, baking cookies, fixing a button on Victor's shirt, laughing beside Marna at some long-forgotten holiday. But in the back was a new photo. It was of me. Taken a few weeks ago, standing in Marna's garden, wind in my hair, eyes closed, head tilted back like I was listening to the sky. I took it the last time I visited, she said. You didn't know. I traced the edges of the picture. You looked peaceful, she added, and for the first time, I saw you. After she left, I sat by the fireplace and stared at that image. Not because I needed to remember, but because I needed to recognize myself. There was no longing in me anymore. No hunger for apology, no ache for repair. What Delia gave me that day wasn't closure. It was companionship. a shared silence between two women who had found each other in the wreckage, not to rescue, but to witness. And that's the thing no one tells you about healing. It's not a finish line. It's a room you build inside yourself. So when someone knocks on the door, you're not waiting to be rescued. You're ready to welcome them in, on your terms. I rise with the sun now, not because I have to, because I want to. There's something holy about those early hours, the hush before the world wakes, the sky shifting from deep gray to pale gold, the warmth of tea in my palms while the house still breathes softly. Marna sleeps in most mornings. Delia visits more often now, sometimes staying for the weekend. She helps in the garden, reads beside me. We don't talk as much as we used to, but we don't need to. She sits near, and I feel the weight of her love without needing it to be spoken. I walk every day, slowly, mindfully, down the same gravel path along the back edge of the property. There's a wooden bench tucked beneath the sycamore trees. I sit there often with my journal, not to document pain, not anymore, but to remember, to see myself clearly, not just the woman who was left, but the woman who stayed with herself. I used to think my life would end quietly, washed away, unnoticed, but now I understand. I was never the silence. I was the structure, the foundation, the pages holding the story together. I was never gone. I was just unheard. And now? Now I don't need anyone to clap when I speak. I just need my voice to echo in the right places. Last week I planted new seeds in the garden, wildflowers mostly. They won't bloom until spring, long after this winter has passed. And that's okay, because I've learned that not everything beautiful blooms in your lifetime. Some things you plant just so the world remembers you were here. And that's what I've done. I've left my letters, my words, my truth, not out of bitterness, but to remind the next woman who wonders if she matters, that she does, even when they stop looking, even when they laugh, even when they leave. She matters. The other day, Marna asked me if I ever thought about what I'd want on my headstone. I smiled. I don't want one, I said. She raised her eyebrow. I shrugged. Let them tell my story in the way I lived it, quiet, persistent, unfinished. Because the truth is, I'm not done. Even if the doctors say time is short, even if my body is slower, softer, tired, I still write, I still plant, I still speak, and I still live in the way I choose. And if you're watching this right now, maybe you needed to hear this. You don't have to scream to be powerful. You don't have to stay to be loyal. You don't have to break things to walk away. You are allowed to outgrow your silence. You are allowed to reclaim your voice. You are allowed to leave gracefully. And if someone ever tries to bury your truth, stand up, speak softly, and let the room tremble. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments, what truth are you ready to reclaim? We read every word you share. Don't forget to like this video if you felt something. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, subscribe for more real, powerful stories every week. Your voice matters. Never forget that.